So let's talk about why people become monsters in One Punch Man. And I don't mean just what Dr. Genus tells us, because that explains how they become them, but I mean more so like why monsters even exist in the first place, which hasn't been explained yet. Because it's supposed to be, I guess, a big secret that will ultimately be revealed towards the end of the series. Because monsters aren't like something that has always existed in the One Punch Man world. It's kind of like a new thing to humanity. I mean, relatively new. And that being said, I'm going to have to go into manga spoilers. So, there's your warning. So first, let's go over what Dr. Genus tells us about how people become monsters, because that's important. So he says, when human beings become monsters, there's an explosion of frustration resulting from unsatisfied desires and the urge to transform. Driven by destructive behaviors and psychological complexes, the individual's past circumstances and other factors may give rise to cellular abnormalities and spontaneous mutation. There are many cases of living things other than human beings turning into monsters due to environmental pollution and other triggers. These are reborn as new creatures. Broadly speaking, the sea folk who attacked City J and the aliens who attacked City A were also monsters, but they were natural creatures with an innate animosity towards humankind. So that explains that, how people become monsters. But to further explain like why monsters always weren't a thing in the One Punch Man world, we're gonna have to go into the deep lore of the backstory of the One Punch Man world, which My Mask explains to Saitama in chapter 208. He says that long ago, many nations fought over land and resources, resulting in numerous world wars. Plummeting populations caused the human species to focus on its survival. They developed a unified language and government. That was the first transformation. However, the world wars had resulted in poisoning of the natural environment, drastic climate change, rising sea levels, and increasing numbers of hazardous organisms. Humanity abandoned other lands, prioritized development of this supercontinent, and moved there in great masses. That was the second transformation. Now, under the administration of this lone nation, the human race has once again grown. Human beings are ecosystem engineers. That means that they're a special kind of living being who can control the environment for their benefit. Despite having weak bodies compared to other animals, they have survived for a long time. Yet influencing the environment won't solve everything, for we faced a third transformation. The proliferation of a natural enemy possessed of intelligence, in a word, monsters. They were a rare phenomenon until a few years ago. But recently, the evacuation warnings sound so often, one grows sick of it. Even worse, many come from our own ranks. So he doesn't outright say that monsters were never a thing at all, but in my opinion, it is implied that they weren't. And them just being a rare phenomenon until just a couple years ago, I think further solidifies that. So now I'm going to go into some deep theory stuff, which some of you may agree with, some of you may not, and that's fine because none of this is confirmed, but I'm pretty confident that this is what's going on here. So the long and the short of it is that monsters come from God. God is like the final boss of One Punch Man. He's the overarching villain that all things start and end with. At this point in the series, he's still pretty shrouded in mystery and ambiguous to a degree, but I feel that there's enough knowledge for me to make an entire video dedicated to him, so I'm not going to focus too much on him in this video. Like I said, I'll make another follow-up video explaining him, especially after the last episode of Season 3, because I think it will end with us seeing the mural of God, which will entice casuals to search for him, so I guess that's a good time to do it. But speaking of that mural, when Saitama finally encounters Orochi underneath the Monster Association, Orochi brings Saitama down to the bottom of it to explain to him what Orochi's purpose is, or what he believes his purpose is. And it's to become like this God. Not the God, because at this time Orochi isn't aware of like God himself, the final boss of One Punch Man. Orochi thinks that he himself is going to become that. Orochi was able to find this mural by instinctually venturing into the Earth's depths in an attempt to drain energy directly from the deepest parts of it. And when he found this mural, he saw that the monster on it looked just like him. And also somehow he's able to read this ancient text just inherently. And it said, "Crossing the vast expanse of time, our God shall resurrect on this earth, when on this altar a worthy sacrifice is offered. And right here, I think we're seeing why monsters are a thing and how people become them. Because as we see, people are depicted on here giving offerings up to Orochi, but it's actually not Orochi. Orochi himself turns out to be the grand offering for God himself once the full mural is revealed after Saitama defeats Orochi. But the offerings, as we see, are like sea animals, like a pig, even babies, I guess what could be depicted as water, maybe wine, and they all have like these spirals on them. And if we look down at the mural, we see that the spiral looks like an eye, and that's because the eye, which is also depicted on the moon, from the crater left by Saitama being kicked there by Boros, represents the eye of God, meaning like he's always watching, observing. And it's because these offerings that they are giving to God have been contaminated by him, which means that the agriculture, or just food and drink in general, is contaminated. And that's the long and the short of it, why people become monsters. They are eating contaminated food. And it's actually been in front of our faces this whole time, because back in episode 1, or chapter 2, when we're introduced to Crab Lante, he straight up tells us that I transformed into Crab Lante after eating too much crab. And of course, that's supposed to be like a gag sequence, and it's supposed to make the viewer laugh and everything, but it's also just one doing what he usually does in this series with double layering everything and hiding things in plain sight, because that is why people become monsters. The food is contaminated. I think that's also why evil natural water, one of the cadres of the Monster Association, is named that. Yes, that is also like a joke. But also it's because the water is evil and it's natural because it's contaminated by God. And it's like, how does he contaminate it? Well, because there's just ways that God can sometimes interact with the world through a tangible means, even though he is not physically within it. As we saw later on in the Monster Association arc, he could just spawn Sage Centipede out of nowhere, so I'm sure he can do that with the water and the food and all that stuff. And going back to what my master was talking about with how the world wars have resulted in poisoning of the natural environment, drastic climate change, and humanity abandoned other lands and prioritized development of this supercontinent and moved there in great masses. Well, it's like having everyone in this centralized area. Well, it's like, first of all, poisoning of the natural environment. I think that's a hint there. Although it doesn't literally mean like the food that God is poisoning. It just means like as a result of the wars, which the wars are a result of God in general, I assume. And I'll talk about that in the God video. But having everyone condensed on this supercontinent is a much easier way of generating all of these monsters, because you have all the population in one place, all eating the same food, and it eventually ramps up to the point of where you're getting monsters all the time coming from people, as my mass mentioned. And also going back to Dr. Genus explaining the sea folk, like Deep Sea King, he said, broadly speaking, the sea folk who attacked City J were also monsters, but they were natural creatures with an innate animosity towards humankind. It's because it all started way back whenever this mural was made, which I guess was like thousands of years ago, when God had first started interacting with humanity. And also we see like a baby being put up here, meaning that there are some humans that become monsters from birth, essentially. And that's also hinted at with the monster Pureblood back in chapter 89. Because he says, "For I am the last remnant of the vampire clan that's existed since time immemorial. I was born a monster, a genuine monster." Also, and aside from that, I think another thing that points at food being contaminated and you having to eat it to become a monster in the first place too, that allows you to have that cellular abnormality and spontaneous mutation, is that when monster cells are introduced, you have to eat them to become a monster, and you have to willingly eat them. Like Goketsu specifically mentions that. You can't be like force-fed it. And I guess that also goes into the dichotomy between Saitama and God. Because when Sonic like cooks the monster cells, we see that, he's using fire and whatnot. Like he doesn't become a monster after he cooks them and eats them. He would have had to eat it raw. And the fire represents Saitama, who is the sun. And the monster cells represent the moon, who is God. Like, that's what One Punch Man is ultimately boiled down to. The sun versus the moon. The same way that One Piece is. And also, speaking of Saitama, another really interesting thing about him and food is that we see that throughout the series, most of his diet is like that of a vegetarian. Like, he never really gets meat on his own. Either he can't afford it, or he's just unable to acquire it just through his own means. It's always given to him. And at this point, I'm really going to have to go into ultra spoilers. This is beyond the manga. This is like the webcomic, which is a few years ahead of the manga. So check out now if you don't want to know an insane spoiler for a future shocking reveal in the story. Here's your warning. So anyway, long story short, it turns out that Dr. Kuseno, Genos' like surrogate grandpa or whatever, the guy who made Genos the way that he is, turns out that he's evil and that he's probably the leader of the organization. Well, going back to the Hot Pot chapter, which is, I guess, 89, we see that he kind of bribed Saitama with meat. And it's because, meat is evil, and so is Dr. Kuseno. But let me know what you think about all of this in the comments, guys. Do you think people become monsters because the food and the agriculture is contaminated? Let me know. And if you liked it, please give it a like, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.